They completed it before anyone could object. Sierra Leone, Rockall Creek, September 10th, 2000. Dawn light breaking across a river that had never been part of any strategic plan London had made for West Africa. 6 men in captivity. 1 militia force numbering approximately 200 fighters. 400 British soldiers waiting in a location they weren't supposed to assault unless the politicians agreed it was worth the risk. And in a tent somewhere in the dense bush along the creek, the men who would have to make the decision to launch the operation happening in real time, knowing that if they waited for London to hold a proper meeting and issue a properly documented order, their window to recover the hostages would close. The Westside Boys militia had seized the 6 soldiers from 1st Battalion Royal Irish Regiment exactly 1 week earlier. They had moved the hostages downriver to Giberibana, a small settlement on a creek so narrow that a man could throw a stone across it, and the helicopter pilots would have to adjust their approach to avoid the dense tree canopy on the far bank. This is the story of what happened when a tactical window and a bureaucratic process tried to occupy the same moment in time, and how the men on the ground decided they couldn't wait anymore. The capture had happened on September 3rd, 2000. 6 soldiers in a Land Rover, part of a patrol that had been sent to make contact with the Westside Boys and to conduct reconnaissance on the militia's positions along a river in the eastern part of Sierra Leone. The patrol had been poorly briefed, inadequately supported, and had driven into an ambush that the liaison officer was supposed to have prevented, but hadn't. The driver was wounded trying to escape. 5 of the 6 men were captured immediately. The 6th man fought through the ambush and got away, but not before he'd been cut with machetes and shot in the shoulder. He made it back to the British compound and reported what had happened. The British response had been immediate and fierce. By that evening, British helicopters were flying strikes against the militia positions. By the next morning, the British had established that the 5 men were still alive and that the Westside Boys had not executed them. They had something else in mind: negotiation. The Westside Boys were not a formally organized military force. They were a militia built on the fragments of a civilian war that had consumed Sierra Leone for 11 years. Charles Taylor's Liberian forces had poured across the border to destabilize the government. The Revolutionary United Front had recruited children and cocaine addicts and had turned entire regions into zones of violence and slavery. The government army had eventually split between units that were fighting the war and units that were participating in the smuggling and resource extraction that had become the real economy of the conflict. The Westside Boys had emerged from this chaos as one of the most brutal of the armed groups. They had a core of experienced fighters drawn from soldiers who had deserted from the government army. They had access to weapons diverted from military supplies or stolen from government armories. And they had a reputation for shocking violence that extended beyond mere combat effectiveness into the realm of systematic brutality. The Westside Boys had primarily operated in the eastern districts of Sierra Leone, around Port Loko and along the Rockall Creek area. They had retreated to the Rockall Creek area after the British intervention in Sierra Leone in May 2000 had begun to shift the military balance. The British had arrived initially as advisors and trainers, but had evolved into an active combatant force as the situation deteriorated. By September 2000, the British presence had stabilized the security situation enough that the government army could begin offensive operations against the rebel groups. The Westside Boys, facing this deteriorating situation, had begun to think in terms of hostage-taking rather than conventional military operations. They understood that hostages provided leverage in ways that military victories no longer could. The negotiation phase lasted 1 week. The Westside Boys demanded money, demanded weapons, demanded that the British agree to leave Sierra Leone. The British, operating under the command of Brigadier David Richards, a tall, thoughtful officer who had spent enough time in Africa to understand that linear negotiations were often the fastest way to escalate a crisis, made it clear that the British would pay nothing and would demand the release of the soldiers. The negotiations went nowhere, which was exactly what was supposed to happen. The negotiations were buying time for the military planning to proceed. Brigadier Richards was not a man who waited for approval when circumstances were changing faster than the approval process could accommodate. He was not insubordinate. He was not reckless. He was a man who understood that there was a specific window where the operation would succeed, and windows that opened on different timescales than the bureaucratic decision-making process in London. The logistics for the operation were already falling into place. The helicopter units that would conduct the insertions and extractions were already positioning themselves. The 1st Battalion Parachute Regiment, the crack assault element that would provide the heavy support for the operation, was already preparing to move to the launch positions. The SAS assault teams that would actually conduct the assault on the Westside Boys positions were already doing their final briefings. The intelligence picture on the Westside Boys position at Geberi Bana was solid. British air reconnaissance had been conducting overhead surveillance of the area continuously since the capture. The militia force had established a routine. They had posted sentries in relatively predictable patterns. They had located the 6 hostages in a specific compound. They had established patterns of movement that were vulnerable to a fast, decisive assault that came without warning and moved with enough speed and violence to paralyze their decision-making capability. D Squadron SAS, the unit that would conduct the main assault on the militia position, had been in Sierra Leone as part of the broader British military advisory operation that had been underway since May 2000. These were not men who had just arrived from England. These were men who had been present in the theatre, who understood the terrain, who had conducted multiple operations in the previous months and had a feel for how this particular militia operated. They had trained extensively for the operation, memorized every detail of the compound layout, understood the timing requirements, and prepared the kind of minute-by-minute operational plan that governed how SAS assault operations worked. The assault would have to be conducted with overwhelming speed and violence to paralyze the militia's ability to respond. The SAS doctrine for close-quarters battle demanded moving fast enough to control the space while remaining slow enough to see what was actually in front of them. The careful planning meant that every soldier understood his role, every timing marker was synchronized, and every contingency had been discussed and rehearsed. The operation had been planned with the assumption that it would take less than 10 minutes from the first insertion to the final extraction. The approval process, meanwhile, was proceeding through different channels. The operation would require clearance from the British cabinet. It would require the agreement of the senior military commanders. It would require the understanding that there was a real possibility of British casualties, that the Westside Boys would fight back, and that despite the careful planning and the overmatch in firepower, something could go wrong and soldiers could die. These were the considerations that required cabinet-level approval. These were the considerations that London needed to properly understand before giving permission. The morning of September 10th arrived. The cabinet meeting was scheduled for 8 in the morning London time. The operation was scheduled to launch at 6 in the morning Sierra Leone time, which was 5 in the morning London time. The timing was the problem. The window to launch the assault would close in a few hours. If the operation wasn't conducted on the morning of September 10th, the window would slip into the afternoon, and the militia would begin moving again, and the helicopter support would have to be rearranged, and the intelligence picture would potentially become outdated. The window was real. It was measurable. It was going to close whether or not London held its meeting. Brigadier Richards made the decision. The operation would launch. The formal cabinet approval could come afterward if needed, but the men on the ground understood the situation well enough to know that waiting for London's permission was equivalent to accepting the risk that the hostages might be killed or moved beyond reach. The SAS would assault at dawn. The one para company that would provide the blocking force would move into position to prevent escape routes from being used. The helicopters would be ready to extract everyone at the moment the assault went down. And London would find out that the operation had been launched when it was already in execution. This is the moment that explains the documentary title. Nobody cleared the SAS for that mission in the formal bureaucratic sense. Brigadier Richards had decided that the tactical window and the military necessity overrode the need for formal political approval. He had assumed responsibility for that decision. He had judged that a cabinet-level authority would agree with the decision if it was presented with the same information he had. But he was not going to wait for the decision to be made through normal channels while the operational window closed and his hostages moved further beyond reach. The assault itself began at first light. 2 SAS teams fast-roped from Lynx helicopters directly into the militia compound. The operation was not subtle. It was not designed to be subtle. It was designed to move with overwhelming speed, to kill everyone who posed a threat, to extract the hostages, and to be gone within minutes. The militia had never expected an assault directly on their position. They had expected that negotiations would continue, that the British would attempt some kind of negotiated release, that they had time to consolidate their position and establish better security. The assault shattered those assumptions. The SAS moved through the compound with the kind of controlled violence that constitutes their doctrine. Targets were engaged. Militia fighters who tried to organize a resistance were suppressed. The compound was cleared in the kind of professional manner that comes from training and from the willingness to accept casualties to prevent worse outcomes. The 6 hostages were located and moved under guard toward the extraction point. 1 SAS trooper was killed during the assault. Trooper Brad Tinian, a man from southern England, a professional soldier who had served in the Falkland Islands and had learned his trade in operations across the world. He was shot during the final phase of the assault while moving to secure an additional sector of the compound. His death was the cost of the operation. His death was the cost of moving when the window was open instead of waiting for approval that might have come too late. Tinian had been in the regiment for 5 years by the time of the Sierra Leone operation. He had deployed to Northern Ireland multiple times and had developed a reputation as a reliable operator with good judgment in close-quarters situations. His death in Sierra Leone was the first British casualty of the intervention, a fact that would have significant political resonance in London once the operation became public knowledge. The 1 para-blocking force had been positioned to prevent the militia from escaping downriver or melting into the bush. The blocking positions worked. The militia that tried to withdraw from the compound ran into prepared British defensive positions and were either killed or captured. No organized counter-assault developed. No militia column attempted to rush the landing zone where the helicopters were waiting. The assault had moved with enough speed and surprise to paralyze the militia's ability to respond. The extraction helicopters landed as the assault teams moved toward them with the hostages. The hostages were loaded. The SAS teams disengaged in the professional manner that characterized how these operations unfolded. The Chinook helicopter that would carry the main element out lifted off. The Lynx helicopters that had inserted the assault teams provided covering fire as they pulled out of the immediate area. Within 8 minutes of the first SAS soldiers fast roping down into the compound, the entire assault force was airborne and moving away from Gaberi Bana. The political consequences of the operation came later. The cabinet meeting that was supposed to have happened at 8 in the morning London time found itself in the position of ratifying a decision that had already been made on the ground. Approval for an operation that had already been launched. A decision to use force that had already been executed. The cabinet had to decide whether to endorse the operation or to repudiate it. Brigadier Richards had placed them in a position where repudiating it would mean admitting that a senior military commander had deliberately disobeyed civilian authority. It would mean claiming that the operation had been wrong even though it had succeeded. It would mean damaging the political relationship between the military and the civilian government at a moment when the military was successfully managing a complex intervention in West Africa. The cabinet endorsed the operation. The formal approval came after the fact, but it came. Brigadier Richards had been right about how the decision would fall once London understood the circumstances. He had been right about what the military necessity demanded. And he had been right that waiting for formal approval through normal channels would have meant accepting an unacceptable risk to the hostages. The 6 Royal Irish Regiment soldiers were medically evacuated. 4 of them had sustained significant injuries from their initial capture and from the conditions of their captivity. All 6 were alive. All 6 would eventually recover. The operation had achieved its primary objective, the recovery of all hostages without any of the hostages being killed. The cost had been 1 SAS soldier killed and several others wounded. The cost had also included the political risk of launching an operation without formal approval. But that political risk had been accepted because the tactical window and the military necessity demanded it. The operation at Giberibana became the template for how British Special Forces would conduct hostage rescue operations in the future. It established the principle that in cases where hostages were in imminent danger and a tactical window was closing, the military commander on the ground could launch an operation in response to that window, assuming that political authority would ratify the decision if the operation succeeded. This principle would be tested repeatedly in the operations that followed. The significance of the operation extended beyond the specific rescue of the 6 soldiers. It established that the British military was willing to take casualties to accomplish operational objectives. It established that hostage rescue was a sufficiently important objective to justify the risks involved. And it established that the gap between tactical windows and bureaucratic approval processes was something that military commanders could navigate if they understood the political environment well enough, and if they were willing to assume responsibility for the decision. The window as operational doctrine was not accidental, it was deliberate. It was based on precise intelligence about when the militia would be at its most vulnerable, and when the hostages would be in the most secure location, which paradoxically was also the location where they could be extracted most quickly, and when the weather and light conditions would be optimal for the helicopter insertions and extractions. All of these factors came together on the morning of September 10th. They would not come together again for days if the operation had to be delayed. This is how military operations work at the tactical level. Time is not unlimited. Windows open and close, conditions change. Waiting for perfect information often means waiting for conditions that will never be perfect. The challenge for a military commander is to decide whether the information available is sufficient to launch an operation and to launch it at the moment when conditions are most favorable, rather than waiting for approval processes that move on a different timeline than the operational environment. Brigadier Richards understood that the British cabinet would want to authorize the operation properly. He understood that there was a formal chain of authority and that circumventing that chain created risks to civil-military relations. But he also understood that by the time the cabinet met and deliberated and reached a decision, the window would have closed. He made a calculated decision to launch the operation and to assume that the cabinet would ratify the decision once it was presented with the facts of the situation. This decision was not unprecedented in military history. Military commanders have made similar decisions throughout history when the tactical situation demanded action faster than bureaucratic processes could provide. The question is not whether it was proper to make the decision. The question is whether the judgment about the window and about what the cabinet would decide turned out to be correct. In this case, Brigadier Richards's judgment was correct on both counts. The operation was successful. The cabinet ratified the decision, and the precedent was set that in the British military, a senior commander could make a decision to launch a hostage rescue operation without waiting for formal cabinet approval if the circumstances and timing demanded it. The precedent that followed this operation would shape how British special operations would be conducted in the years ahead. The principle that military commanders could launch operations without formal approval if circumstances demanded it became embedded in how the British conducted special operations. It was not a violation of civil control. It was an understanding that civil control had to accommodate the reality of operational windows and the necessity of making decisions in real time rather than waiting for bureaucratic processes. This pattern became increasingly common in British military operations in the years that followed, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan. Brigadier Richards would go on to command larger operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the principle that he established in Sierra Leone, that a military commander could launch an operation without waiting for formal approval if the circumstances demanded it, would influence how British special operations were conducted in those conflicts as well. The precedent set by the successful operation at Giberibana was that the political authority trusted the military commander to make these decisions and would ratify the decision afterwards if it was necessary. This trust was not infinite. The operation had to succeed. The operation had to achieve its stated objective with minimum loss of life. The political risk had to be manageable. All of these conditions were met in the case of Operation Barras. The operation succeeded. All hostages were recovered. Only one SAS soldier was killed. The political risk was manageable because the cabinet wanted the hostages recovered and was willing to ratify an operation that had already been launched in order to accomplish that objective. The decision window and operational necessity created a unique situation where formal authorization procedures had to be circumvented in order to accomplish the stated objective. This is where the story transitions from tactical to strategic significance. The tactical problem was clear. 6 British soldiers were being held by a militia that had demonstrated willingness to use violence and had made clear they would not negotiate seriously. The strategic problem was that the formal processes for authorizing military operations did not accommodate the reality that the tactical window for successful action was measured in hours, not days. Brigadier Richards's decision to launch the operation was not a decision to violate civilian control of the military. It was a decision that civil control had to accommodate the reality of operational windows and tactical necessity. The cabinet, in ratifying the decision, accepted that this accommodation was necessary and preferable to the alternative of leaving soldiers in captivity while awaiting proper authorization procedures. The operation itself demonstrated that military judgment about tactical necessity could be trusted because the operation succeeded exactly as planned, with all objectives achieved and acceptable losses incurred. The Westside Boys militia was devastated by the operation. Their position had been overrun. Their hostages had been extracted. Their force structure had been damaged. The group would eventually be eliminated as a significant military factor in Sierra Leone. The operation at Guberibana was the beginning of the end for the Westside Boys as an active militia. The river returned to silence after the helicopters left. The compound at Guberibana stood empty. The militia fighters who had not been killed or captured had melted into the bush, and Brigadier Richards had established that when the window was closing and the tactical necessity was clear, a military commander could move without waiting for bureaucratic approval, assuming that the political authority would understand the decision once it was made. The window to launch the operation had been measured in hours. The decision window had to accommodate the reality that military operations in the field sometimes move faster than the decision-making process in the capital. Brigadier Richards understood that he was placing the cabinet in a position where they would have to ratify his decision, or else openly repudiate a military commander who had taken action to accomplish the stated military objective. The cabinet could not credibly claim that the operation should not have been launched once they understood that the operation had already been launched and that the hostages were already being recovered. Brigadier Richards was betting that the cabinet would see it his way once they understood the circumstances. He was betting that the political necessity of recovering the hostages was greater than the political embarrassment of a military commander launching an operation without formal authorization. He was betting correctly. The operation could have been repudiated. The cabinet could have issued a statement claiming that the operation had been conducted without proper authorization and that the military command had exceeded its mandate. But the political consequences of such a statement would have been severe, essentially admitting that the civilian government had chosen to leave 6 soldiers in captivity rather than support an unauthorized rescue. The decision to launch the operation at dawn rather than to wait for the cabinet meeting represented a calculation about the operational window and about how long the window could remain open before the conditions changed. If the operation had been delayed until after the cabinet meeting and after formal authorization had been granted, the delay would have been approximately 12 hours. In 12 hours, the militia could have moved the hostages. The militia could have increased their security measures. The weather could have deteriorated. The moon phase would have changed. The entire operational picture could have shifted in ways that would have made the assault much riskier and much less likely to succeed. The moment when the first SAS soldiers fast-roped from the Lynx helicopters into the militia compound was the moment when the operation became irreversible. Before that moment, Brigadier Richards could have changed his mind. The helicopters could have been diverted, the operation could have been called off. But once the first soldiers hit the ground inside the militia compound, the operation was committed. The cabinet, meeting in London, would learn that British soldiers were actively assaulting the Westside Boys militia position. The moment when one SAS trooper was killed was a moment where the operation's success was purchased with a military casualty. Trooper Brad Tinian died moving to secure an additional sector of the compound. His death was the cost of the speed and violence of the assault. His death was the cost of moving without hesitation through the compound and taking control of all the spaces where the militia could organize a response or where they could harm the hostages. The 6 soldiers from the Royal Irish Regiment would eventually return to their units. Some of them would leave the military. Some of them would continue serving. All of them would carry with them the knowledge that their rescue had cost one SAS trooper his life, and that the operation to recover them had been launched without waiting for formal political authorization. The intelligence picture that enabled the decision was critical to its success. The British had been conducting overhead reconnaissance continuously since the capture. They had been flying Chinook and Lynx helicopters in ways designed to gather intelligence while maintaining the appearance of casual patrol activity. The intelligence picture showed the militia at its most vulnerable: posted sentries in predictable patterns, hostages in a specific compound, movement patterns vulnerable to assault. This intelligence was not perfect, but it was sufficient for Brigadier Richards to make a decision and for the SAS to plan and execute an operation with a high degree of confidence. The intelligence also showed that if the operation was delayed, the militia would begin moving the hostages. The Westside Boys had a pattern of moving hostages every few days to maintain narrative control over the negotiation situation. The temporal intelligence, information about how long the window would remain open, was critical to Richards's decision. The operation also revealed something about how the West African situation was being managed. The British military intervention in Sierra Leone was officially limited in scope. The British were there as military advisors and trainers. They were not there as a combat force. The operation against the Westside Boys was not authorized under that limited mandate. It was an unauthorized combat operation launched to recover hostages. It violated the formally understood limits of British military engagement in Sierra Leone. Yet once the operation succeeded, those limits had to be revised and reinterpreted. The British military had expanded its mandate through action, and the political authority had ratified the expansion after the fact. This pattern of military action, followed by political ratification, would become significant in how Britain conducted operations in subsequent conflicts. The implications for future military operations extended well beyond Sierra Leone. The operation demonstrated something important about how alliances operate when different parts of the alliance have different capabilities and different decision-making processes. The British approach was characterized by greater flexibility in how resources could be employed, while the formal structures that governed American military operations created bureaucratic constraints on the use of those resources. In many operational situations, the British flexibility could be more valuable than superior resources. The operation at Gaberibana established a pattern for how British special forces would conduct military operations in the years that followed. The pattern was that military commanders on the ground could make decisions about whether to launch operations based on their assessment of the operational window and the military necessity, without waiting for formal authorization from higher political authorities. This autonomy would make British special forces more effective at responding to time-sensitive situations where the window for action was brief, and where waiting for approval would mean accepting the risk that the opportunity would be lost. The 6 Royal Irish soldiers understood that their rescue had cost a military life. The knowledge did not diminish their gratitude for the rescue. The knowledge added a dimension of sacrifice and obligation to the rescue. Trooper Brad Tinian had been a young man from the southwest of England. He had served in the Falkland Islands and multiple operations before Sierra Leone. He had understood that the operations he was conducting carried the risk of death. He had accepted that risk as part of his commitment. His death was not meaningless. It was the consequence of moving forward under fire to secure a position critical to the overall assault. It was the consequence of a commitment to completing the mission. The cabinet, in deciding to ratify the operation, implicitly decided that Tinian's death had been necessary and that the decision to launch the operation had been correct. The broader context of the British military presence in Sierra Leone would extend beyond Operation Barras. The operation provided political support for the continued British military presence in Sierra Leone. It demonstrated that the military intervention was accomplishing its objectives. It demonstrated that the resources committed were being used effectively. What remained after the immediate crisis passed was the precedent. The understanding that military commanders could launch operations in response to tactical windows and military necessity without waiting for formal approval became embedded in how the British conducted special operations. From the military perspective, the cost-benefit analysis was straightforward. The loss of one soldier to recover 6 soldiers was an acceptable trade-off, especially when the alternative was accepting an unacceptable risk that the hostages would be moved beyond reach or executed. From the political perspective, the calculus was more complex. The cabinet had to decide whether a military commander's unauthorized use of force could be tolerated, especially when it succeeded. The decision to ratify the operation implicitly decided that the recovery of British soldiers justified both the casualties incurred and the violation of formal authorization procedures. This decision established a precedent about what kinds of military actions could be undertaken without formal authorization, particularly in situations where tactical windows and military necessity demanded immediate action. The river at Rockall Creek flowed on after the helicopters left. The settlement at Giberibana existed as a place where something significant had occurred. The Westside Boys militia was disrupted and eventually eliminated as the broader British military intervention in Sierra Leone continued, and the precedent remained. When the window was closing and the tactical necessity was clear, a military commander could move without waiting for bureaucratic approval, assuming that the political authority would understand the decision once it was made. The title of this documentary is exact. Nobody cleared the SAS for that mission. The operation was launched without formal cabinet approval. It was launched on the authority of a military commander who understood the circumstances and who was willing to assume responsibility for the decision. And the operation succeeded. That success meant that the precedent was set. That success meant that the next operation could be launched with slightly less fear that political authority would repudiate a decision that had already been made. That success meant that Trooper Brad Tinian's death was acknowledged as the price that had to be paid for a hostage rescue operation that could not wait for formal approval. The formal British military assessment after Operation Barras was measured and cautious. The official records described the operation as successful in all respects, a phrase that encompassed the tactical success of the assault, the recovery of all hostages without casualties among the hostages, and the political success of maintaining public support for the continued British military presence in Sierra Leone. The investigation into how the operation had been authorized found that Brigadier Richards had acted within the authority granted to him as the senior military commander in Sierra Leone, even though the specific interpretation of that authority represented a significant expansion of what had previously been understood as the scope of his decision-making power. The cabinet accepted this interpretation without formally challenging it, which amounted to an implicit acceptance that field commanders could make decisions about the use of force without prior approval when the tactical circumstances demanded it. The broader implications of Operation Barras extended into how the British military would conduct operations for the next 2 decades. The principle that was established in Sierra Leone, that a field commander could launch an operation without waiting for political approval if the tactical window was closing, would be invoked repeatedly in Iraq and Afghanistan. The specific circumstances were different in each case, but the underlying logic was the same. When the window of opportunity was narrowing faster than the political approval process could accommodate, the field commander had the authority and the responsibility to make the decision and to launch the operation. This principle would sometimes prove controversial, particularly when operations had outcomes that differed from what had been expected. But it would remain embedded in how British special operations were conducted. Brigadier Richards himself would become one of the most influential military thinkers of his generation. He would command larger operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. He would eventually become the senior military officer advising the British government on military strategy. The principle that he had established in Sierra Leone, that military judgment about tactical necessity could sometimes supersede bureaucratic process, would become reflected in the broader doctrine that governed how British special forces operated. Richards would argue in papers and in strategic discussions that the political authority in a democracy had to accept that field commanders would occasionally make decisions that the political authority had not explicitly authorized, because the alternative was accepting an unacceptable risk or missing an opportunity that would not come again. This principle was not universally accepted, even within the British military. There were officers who believed that circumventing the political approval process represented a dangerous precedent, that it could lead to military commanders making decisions based on their own judgment about what the political authority would want, rather than on explicit authorization from that authority. There were civilians in the British government who worried that accepting the principle of commanders' discretion in tactical situations could lead to a gradual erosion of civilian control over the military. But the simple fact was that Operation Barras had succeeded. The hostages had been recovered. One SAS soldier had been killed, which was tragic, but all 6 hostages had lived. In the calculus of political success and failure, the operation had been an unambiguous success. The aftermath of Operation Barras saw the consolidation of British military control over the security situation in Sierra Leone. The government forces, backed by British special forces and by the improved security situation that followed the operation, were able to consolidate control over the eastern districts of the country. The Revolutionary United Front eventually agreed to a ceasefire and entered a disarmament process. The Westside Boys militia, stripped of their most dramatic strategic asset in the form of hostages, lost the leverage that had made them relevant to the political situation. They were systematically hunted down and eliminated or captured. By the end of 2000, the security situation in Sierra Leone had stabilized enough that the British military intervention could be declared a success, even if the underlying problems that had created the conflict in the first place had not been fully resolved. Trooper Brad Tinian was buried with full military honors in the southwest of England. His funeral was attended by commanders from across the British military, by soldiers who had served with him, and by members of his family. The ceremony acknowledged his sacrifice and his commitment to the mission. His name was added to the memorial in Hereford that commemorates SAS soldiers who have died in service. The official record noted that his death had occurred during a hostage rescue operation in Sierra Leone, and without specifying the circumstances or noting that the operation had been launched without formal cabinet approval. The record was accurate but incomplete, as official records often are. The 6 Royal Irish soldiers who had been recovered eventually returned to their units. Most of them left the military within a few years, finding that the experience of captivity and rescue had changed their relationship to military service in ways that they could not fully articulate. Some of them remained in contact with the SAS operators who had conducted the assault. Some of them tried to resume their military careers as though nothing had happened. What they all carried with them was the knowledge that their survival had depended on a military commander's willingness to disobey the formal chain of command in order to accomplish the military objective. The precedent established in Sierra Leone would eventually raise questions in British military circles about the proper relationship between political authority and military command. When military commanders can launch operations without explicit political approval, has the line between civil and military authority been crossed in ways that threaten the foundations of democratic control? Or is the recognition that field commanders occasionally need to make decisions faster than the political process can accommodate simply a necessary adaptation to the reality of modern military operations? These questions would be debated in academic journals and in military education institutions for years. They remain debated to the present day. What is clear is that Operation Barras established a precedent that shifted the balance toward greater autonomy for military commanders in the field. Richards himself addressed these questions directly in his later writings and speeches. He argued that the precedent should not be understood as military insubordination or as a rejection of civilian control. Instead, it should be understood as a specific recognition that in certain rare circumstances, when the tactical window is closing and the political consequences of inaction would be catastrophic, a military commander who understands the political environment well enough can make the decision to act and can trust that the political authority will ratify the decision afterward. This argument assumes a level of trust between the military and the political authority that does not always exist. It assumes that the military commander understands the political environment well enough to make that judgment. It assumes that the operation will succeed in ways that make the political ratification a reasonable choice. All of these assumptions were satisfied in the case of Operation Barras. Whether they would continue to be satisfied in other operations remained to be seen. The river at Rockall Creek continued to flow regardless. The compound at Guberibana was eventually abandoned. The settlement returned to its prior obscurity. But the precedent established by the operation launched at dawn without formal approval would ripple forward through British military operations for decades. It would shape decisions made in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in other theaters where the British military would engage in combat operations in the early 21st century. The title of this documentary is exact. Nobody cleared the SAS for that mission. And yet the operation was conducted, the hostages were recovered, and the precedent was set. What that precedent would mean for the future conduct of British military operations remained to be determined. What was certain was that Operation Barras had established that a military commander, under the right circumstances and with sufficient confidence in the political environment, could decide to act without waiting for bureaucratic approval.